After 5 years abroad, Maren Cole came home with flowers in one hand and her mother's favorite lemon cookies in the other. She expected a porch light, a hug, maybe tears. Instead, a county outreach worker led her through the broken doors of an abandoned bus depot in Baltimore. Near the old ticket counter, wrapped in a donated blanket, her 70-year-old mother was sleeping on a folding cot beside a boy Maren had never seen before. The house Maren paid for was gone, the money was gone, and when her mother woke up, she whispered one sentence that made Maren's knees go weak. "Your brother said not to tell you." Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. To understand how Ruth Cole ended up there, the story had to start with a daughter coming home. Maren stepped out of the airport carrying only one suitcase. 5 years. 5 years of double shifts. 5 years of missed holidays. 5 years of telling herself it would all be worth it. As a surgical nurse in London, she had built a stable life. Not glamorous, not wealthy, but stable enough to send money home every month without fail. The first thing she had ever bought with that money was a small row house in Baltimore for her mother. Nothing fancy, just a safe place, a clean kitchen, a front porch, a little garden where Ruth could grow tomatoes in the summer. Whenever Maren called, her older brother Grant always answered with the same calm confidence. "Mom's doing fine, everything's under control, don't worry." And Maren had believed him, because believing him made life easier. That afternoon, she rented a car and drove straight toward the neighborhood. She had not told anyone she was coming. She wanted to see her mother's face when she opened the door. She imagined the surprise, the tears, the laughter, maybe even a scolding for staying away so long. The closer she got, the more excited she felt until she turned onto the street. Then something felt wrong. The house was there, but it was no longer her mother's house. Plywood covered the windows. A demolition notice hung on the front fence. Bright orange paint marked the foundation. Maren parked so quickly she nearly left the keys in the ignition. "No," she whispered. She walked to the porch. The mailbox was gone. The flower beds were dead. A sign from a redevelopment company stood in the yard. "Property acquired. Future site development." Her stomach dropped. A man working across the street noticed her staring. "You looking for somebody?" he asked. "My mother lived here." The man hesitated, then his expression changed. "Ruth Cole?" Maren nodded. The man looked away. "Ma'am, she hasn't been here for a while." The blood drained from her face. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, a county outreach van pulled up near the curb. A woman wearing a city services badge stepped out. She looked at Maren carefully. "You're Maren Cole, aren't you?" Maren froze. "How do you know my name?" The woman sighed. "Your mother talks about you." For a moment, relief flooded through Maren. At least Ruth was alive. "Where is she?" The outreach worker looked uncomfortable. Then she quietly said, "Come with me." 20 minutes later, Maren stood outside a building she never expected to see. The old Lexington bus depot, closed years ago. Most people avoided it. The windows were broken. The concrete walls were stained with age and rain. Inside, makeshift shelters filled the waiting area. Cots, blankets, plastic bags, people trying to survive. Maren's chest tightened. "No." She shook her head before even entering. No. The outreach worker said nothing. She simply led her inside. Near the old ticket counter sat a folding cot. On it was an elderly woman sleeping beneath a faded blanket. Her gray hair was thinner. Her face looked smaller, older, fragile. For one terrible second, Maren did not recognize her own mother. Then Ruth opened her eyes. Confusion crossed her face, then recognition, then shock. "Maren?" The flowers slipped from Maren's hand. The cookie box hit the floor. She dropped to her knees. "Mama." Ruth started crying immediately. Not loud, not dramatic, just the exhausted tears of someone who had been carrying pain for too long. Maren wrapped her arms around her. Her mother felt frighteningly light, like she had lost pieces of herself. For several minutes, neither woman could speak. Then Maren noticed the boy. Thin, dark-haired, maybe 12 years old. He sat quietly beside the cot, watching everything. Protective, careful, like he was waiting to see whether this stranger would hurt Ruth. The outreach worker stepped away to give them privacy. Maren looked back at her mother. "What happened?" Ruth lowered her eyes. "Mama, what happened?" The old woman's hands trembled. She looked terrified. Not of Maren, of something else. of someone else. Then she whispered the words Maren would never forget. Please don't call Grant. Maren stared at her. What? Ruth shook her head quickly. Please. Fear filled her voice, real fear, the kind that should never exist between a mother and her child. Maren slowly turned toward the boy. Who is he? Ruth looked at the child. The boy looked back at her, and for the first time since Maren arrived, Ruth's expression changed. There was sadness, there was shame, but there was also fierce protection. She reached for the boy's hand. Then she looked directly into Maren's eyes. He is family, she said quietly, even if your brother denies it. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The noise of the bus depot seemed to fade into the background, the distant coughs, the squeak of a shopping cart, the hum of traffic outside. Maren stared at the boy. The boy stared back. Then he lowered his eyes and tightened his grip on Ruth's hand. Maren looked at her mother again. What do you mean? She asked quietly. What do you mean he's family? Ruth's eyes filled with worry. Not here. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Please, not here. Maren looked around. Only then did she truly see where her mother had been living. A folding cot, 2 blankets, a small plastic crate holding medicine bottles, a paper bag with a few clothes folded neatly inside. Everything Ruth owned seemed to fit into one corner of a forgotten building. 5 years. 5 years of bank transfers. 5 years of believing her mother was safe. And somehow it had come to this. The county outreach worker approached carefully. My name is Angela, she said. Why don't we get them somewhere warmer? Maren nodded immediately. Within an hour they were sitting in a modest hotel near the inner harbor. Nothing luxurious, just clean sheets, a private bathroom, a door that locked. When Ruth entered the room, she stopped moving. She stood there staring at the bed, the mattress, the lamp beside it, the curtains, simple things, ordinary things. Yet tears suddenly filled her eyes. Maren pretended not to notice. Sometimes dignity survived because someone chose not to point at the pain. Eli sat quietly near the window. He had barely spoken since they left the depot. When hotel staff brought sandwiches and soup, he immediately pushed the larger sandwich toward Ruth. You should eat first. The words were automatic, like a habit, like something he had said many times before. Ruth smiled faintly. You eat too. He nodded but continued watching her until she took the first bite. Only then did he begin eating. Maren noticed everything. Children did not learn behavior like that without a reason. After a while, Angela excused herself and left her card on the table. If you need records or documentation, call me. Documentation. The word lingered in Maren's mind. Something about it felt important. After Angela left, silence settled over the room, the kind that often arrives when a family has too much to say. Maren finally broke it. Mom. Ruth looked up. What happened to the house? The question seemed to age her another year. She stared down at her soup. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she sighed. It was sold. Maren felt her chest tighten. Sold? Ruth nodded. How? I signed papers. What papers? Ruth looked confused. Told me they were hospital forms. The room became very still. Maren leaned forward. What hospital forms? I had pneumonia. Ruth rubbed her hands together nervously. They discharged me. Grant brought paperwork. Said insurance needed signatures. Maren felt a cold sensation move through her body. And you signed them? Yes, you read them? Ruth's expression answered before her words did. No, Maren closed her eyes. Not because she blamed her mother, because she understood exactly how these things happened. An old parent, a trusted child, documents placed in front of them during a stressful moment. A quick signature, a simple request, a terrible consequence. When did you find out the house was gone? Ruth looked ashamed. After what? After the buyers came. Maren stared at her. They came to the house? Ruth nodded. They said they owned it. The words sounded impossible. Yet they had happened. Real life was full of impossible things that became real because someone trusted the wrong person. Maren looked away for a moment. Outside the hotel window, the city moved normally. People walked, cars passed. Life continued. Meanwhile, her mother had lost her home, a home Maren had spent years paying for. What did Grant say? Ruth's shoulders sank. He said it was temporary. And he said I could stay with him. Maren waited. Ruth looked down. He changed his mind. The silence afterward hurt more than the words. Across the room, Eli quietly stood and walked toward the bathroom. He seemed to understand that adults were talking about painful things. The door closed softly behind him. Only then did Maren ask the question she had been holding back. How long were you at the depot? Ruth hesitated. 3 months. Maren felt sick. 3 months, 90 days, 90 nights. While she was working in operating rooms, while she was sending money, while she was believing every reassuring phone call. Months. Why didn't you tell me? Ruth's eyes filled with tears. Grant said you were busy, Mama. He said you worked too hard, Mama. He said if I told you, you'd think I wasted your money. The words hit harder than anything else. Not because they were true, because Ruth believed they might be. Maren moved closer and took her mother's hand. You really thought that? Ruth looked away. I didn't want you disappointed in me. For a moment, Maren could not speak. Her mother had spent her entire life protecting other people from worry. Even now, even after losing everything, she had been protecting everyone except herself. Later that evening, after Ruth fell asleep on the hotel bed, Maren sat alone at the small desk near the window. She opened her laptop, then her banking app. 5 years of transfers appeared on the screen. Month after month, the amounts varied, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, but they never stopped. Every payment had notes. For medication, for taxes, for repairs, for roofing, for plumbing, for home maintenance. Grant had handled everything because he lived nearby, because he sounded responsible, because Maren trusted him. She began scrolling slowly, carefully, line by line, date by date. Then something caught her attention. A transfer from 18 months earlier, $22,000. Purpose, emergency roof replacement. Maren frowned. She remembered that one. A storm. Grant had called saying part of the roof was damaged. He had sounded stressed, concerned. She had transferred the money the same day, without hesitation. Maren turned toward the sleeping bed. Mom? Ruth stirred. What is it? Maren rotated the laptop screen toward her. You remember the roof replacement? Ruth adjusted her glasses, then looked closer. Confusion crossed her face. What roof replacement? Maren pointed at the transfer note. The roof. Ruth stared for several seconds, then slowly shook her head. There was no confusion anymore, only certainty. Her voice came out quiet, steady, almost afraid. There was never any roof repair, and suddenly, for the first time, Maren realized the problem might be far bigger than a stolen house. Maren barely slept that night. The laptop remained open on the desk long after midnight. Transfer after transfer filled the screen. Every note brought back a memory. Emergency furnace repair, property tax shortage, medical expenses, roof replacement. Each payment had sounded reasonable when Grant explained it. At the time, she had never questioned him. Why would she? He was her brother. He lived 15 minutes from their mother. He attended doctor appointments. He answered late-night phone calls, or at least that was what she had believed. Now every transaction felt different. Not because the numbers were large, because trust had been attached to every dollar. Just after sunrise, Maren left the room quietly and walked downstairs to the hotel lobby. She bought coffee and sat alone near a window. Baltimore was waking up. Workers hurried toward buses. Parents walked children to school. People carried ordinary worries into ordinary days. Meanwhile, her family felt like it was coming apart piece by piece. Her phone vibrated. The caller ID showed Grant. She stared at the screen. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. Then she answered. Hey, kid sister. His voice sounded warm, casual, almost cheerful. The sound made her stomach turn. When were you planning to tell me Mom lost her house? Silence. Not long. Just enough. Then came a sigh. I knew somebody would eventually call you. Maren sat forward. Somebody? You don't understand the whole situation. There it was. The first defense. Not denial. Explanation. Then explain it. Grant was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Less friendly. More tired. The house became complicated. Complicated? Property taxes, maintenance, insurance, repairs. Maren almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because she had paid for all of those things. I sent money for every single one of those. You sent money from another country, Grant snapped. You weren't here. The words landed harder than she expected. Not because they were entirely false, because part of them contained a truth she hated. She had not been there. 5 years of phone calls could not replace physical presence. Still, absence was not permission. Where is Mom supposed to live, she asked. Grant hesitated, then said something that chilled her. Mom makes her own choices. The call ended 3 minutes later. Nothing was resolved, yet Maren walked away knowing one thing. Grant wasn't surprised she knew. That meant he had been expecting this day. Back upstairs, Ruth was awake. She sat at the small table with Eli. The boy had spread out a workbook from school. A donated pencil moved slowly across the page. Math problems, fractions, long division, normal things. The sight hurt more than it should have. Children deserved routines, desks, backpacks, not abandoned bus depots. Eli looked up when Marin entered, then quickly returned to his work. The quietness wasn't shyness, it felt more like caution, a child who had learned not to take up too much space. Marin sat beside her mother. "Tell me about Grant." Ruth immediately looked uncomfortable. He wasn't always like this. The answer came too quickly, like she had rehearsed it, like mothers always did when speaking about children who hurt them. "He used to be good." Marin waited. Ruth stared into her coffee. "After your father died, he tried hard." A pause. "He felt responsible." That part made sense. Their father had died when Grant was 19. Marin had only been 14. Grant worked construction jobs during college, helped pay bills, drove Ruth to appointments, fixed things around the house. He had been dependable once. What changed? Ruth's shoulders slumped. Life. The answer sounded simple, but it carried years inside it. Eventually, more pieces emerged. Grant had started his own contracting company 6 years earlier. At first, things went well. Then a few projects failed. A client refused payment. Equipment loans piled up. Material prices increased. 2 employees filed wage complaints after the company missed payroll. Nothing catastrophic, just enough small problems stacking together. 1 bad year became 2. 2 became 3. The pressure never left. He hated asking for help, Ruth said quietly. He always wanted to be the strong one. Marin listened, not defending him, not forgiving him, simply trying to understand. Because people rarely woke up one morning and became villains. Usually they slid there, one compromise at a time, one justification at a time, one lie at a time. Later that afternoon, while Ruth rested, Marin searched public business records online. Grant's company still existed, technically. But the picture wasn't pretty. Several liens appeared: equipment financing, tax issues, court filings from suppliers. Nothing criminal, just debt. Debt everywhere. She sat back in her chair. The pattern was becoming clearer, not complete, but clearer. Then another piece clicked into place. The roof repair, the emergency plumbing, the furnace replacement, the taxes, the medical bills, all those transfers. How much money had she actually sent? She opened a spreadsheet, started adding numbers. Halfway through, she stopped. The total already exceeded $180,000. Her hands went cold. $180,000. Enough to save a struggling business. Enough to pay off creditors. Enough to disappear without attracting attention if it happened slowly. The door opened. Eli stepped inside. He had been exploring the hallway. He stopped when he noticed the spreadsheet. "You look upset." Marin blinked. It was the first spontaneous thing she had heard him say. "I'm okay," he nodded politely. Then looked toward Ruth's sleeping form. "She worries when people are upset." The statement was simple, yet it revealed something. The boy watched Ruth constantly, protected her constantly, as if their survival depended on reading emotions quickly. Marin closed the laptop. "Eli." He looked at her. "How long have you known my mother?" His expression softened. "A while." "How long?" He hesitated, then answered. "Since my mom died." The room became very quiet. "My grandmother?" Marin asked carefully. He shook his head. "My mom." The distinction mattered. The sadness behind it mattered more. Marin didn't push further. Not yet. Children deserved the right to tell their own stories when ready. But one thing became impossible to ignore. The way Ruth looked at him. The way he looked at Ruth. The way both of them seemed afraid of being separated. Something much bigger connected them. Something nobody was saying. That evening, as darkness settled outside, Marin's phone rang again. This time it wasn't Grant. It was Angela, the outreach worker. "There's something you should know." Her voice sounded serious. Marin stood immediately. "What is it?" Angela hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Someone from the county office contacted me today asking whether Ruth was still staying at the depot." Marin frowned. "Who? I don't know." A pause. "But they specifically asked whether she was with a minor child." The room suddenly felt smaller. Marin looked across the room. Eli was helping Ruth fold laundry from a donated bag. Neither of them noticed her staring. Angela continued. "I thought you should know. Whoever made that call seemed very interested in finding them." After the call ended, Marin stood motionless. A terrible feeling had begun growing in her chest, because for the first time, She wasn't only worried about what Grant had already done. She was worried about what he might do next. And across the room, completely unaware, Eli pulled a worn family photograph from his pocket and handed it to Ruth. The moment Ruth saw the picture, all color drained from her face. I've continued the story with the next chapter, following the approved outline and keeping the narrative consistent. The photograph trembled slightly in Ruth's hands. Maren had never seen her mother react that way to a picture. Not even to old family photos after their father's death. For a long moment, Ruth simply stared. Then she carefully placed the photograph on the table. Eli watched her closely. "You okay, Miss Ruth?" The question was gentle, protective. The kind of question a grandson might ask. Ruth forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart." But Maren knew she wasn't. She picked up the photograph. A young woman stood beside a playground fence. She looked to be in her late 20s, dark hair, kind eyes, one arm wrapped around a much younger Eli. The photo was worn from being handled, folded at the corners. "Loved." "Who's this?" Maren asked. Eli looked down. "My mom." The room grew quiet. The answer carried a weight far beyond the simple words. Maren glanced at Ruth. Her mother's expression told her there was more. Much more. The next morning, after breakfast, Maren stepped into the hallway and called Angela. The outreach worker answered immediately. "I was hoping you'd call. I need to understand what's going on," Maren said, "especially about Eli." Angela hesitated. Then she asked carefully, "Has Ruth talked to you yet?" "Not really." Another pause. "Then maybe that's her story to tell first." Maren respected that. Still, Angela agreed to meet later that afternoon. By 3 o'clock, they were sitting in a small conference room inside a community support center. Nothing fancy. Just a table, plastic chairs, coffee that tasted burnt, the sort of place where people came when life stopped working the way it was supposed to. Angela opened a folder. "Eli isn't in foster care," Maren frowned. "I thought he was." "He almost was." Angela slid a document across the table. After his mother died, there was a review. Maren read quietly. No father listed, no legal guardian designated, limited family contacts, temporary kinship placement. Her eyes stopped on the final note: placement accepted by Ruth Cole. Maren looked up. "My mother?" Angela nodded. She stepped forward. The words landed heavily. "How?" "Because nobody else did." Maren leaned back in her chair. Angela continued. "Eli's mother passed away last year from complications related to untreated diabetes." Maren closed her eyes briefly. The boy had lost his mother, just like that. One day she was there, then she wasn't. After her death, county services started looking for relatives. "Your mother got involved. Why?" Angela looked surprised. "Because she cared." The answer was simple, painfully simple, the kind of answer that revealed everything about Ruth's character. Angela continued. "Most people would have stepped away. She didn't. What happened then?" Angela sighed. "Things got complicated." Complicated. Maren was beginning to hate that word. It seemed to appear every time adults failed a child. Complicated how? Angela chose her words carefully. There were questions about the boy's family connections. Maren's pulse quickened. "What kind of connections?" Angela folded her hands. "I can't disclose everything. But your mother seemed convinced he had ties to your family." The room suddenly felt smaller. Maren stared. "What does that mean?" Angela shook her head. "That part needs to come from Ruth." The meeting ended with more questions than answers. On the drive back to the hotel, Maren couldn't stop thinking about Eli, the boy's careful manners, the way he protected Ruth, the way Ruth protected him. Families didn't form like that overnight. Something deeper connected them, something neither of them wanted to discuss. When she returned, she found Eli sitting beside Ruth on a bench outside the hotel. They were feeding pieces of bread to pigeons. For a moment, the sight felt almost peaceful, almost normal. Ruth was smiling, actually smiling. It was the first genuine smile Maren had seen since coming home. Eli noticed her first. "Angela tell you anything?" Maren sat beside them. "A little." The boy nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Then he surprised her. "My mom used to say secrets make people sick." Ruth looked away immediately. The reaction was impossible to miss. Maren waited. Nobody spoke. The pigeons fluttered around their feet. Cars passed on the street. Life continued. Finally, Ruth sighed, a long, tired sigh, the kind that came from carrying something for too long. "Maren," her voice was quiet, "I think it's time." The three of them returned to the room. Once the door closed, Ruth sat on the edge of the bed. For several seconds she stared at her hands. Then she began. Last year I volunteered at a church food pantry. Maren listened. That's where I met Eli's mother. The story unfolded slowly. Her name had been Vanessa, a single mother, working 2 jobs, struggling, trying her best, the kind of woman who never asked for help until things became desperate. Ruth helped her when she could. Groceries, rides, doctor appointments. Then Vanessa got sick, very sick. The illness moved faster than anyone expected. Toward the end, Vanessa became terrified about what would happen to Eli. She asked me to look after him, Ruth said. Her eyes filled with tears. I told her I would. Maren reached for her mother's hand. What happened after she died? Ruth hesitated. Then came the answer. The truth came out. Maren felt a chill. What truth? Ruth looked toward Eli. The boy sat perfectly still. He already knew. That much was obvious. Vanessa told me who she believed his father was. Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Maren's heart began pounding. Who? Ruth swallowed. Then spoke. Grant. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Maren stared at her mother. No. Ruth nodded slowly. Vanessa said they dated years ago. Maren shook her head. This can't be. I don't know if it's true, Ruth interrupted gently. I only know what she told me. The distinction mattered. There was no DNA test, no legal proof. Only a dying mother's belief, and yet the possibility alone changed everything. Maren looked at Eli. The boy lowered his eyes. Not surprised, not shocked, just sad, as if he'd been carrying this uncertainty for a long time. Does Grant know? The question came out barely above a whisper. Ruth closed her eyes. Yes. Maren felt her stomach drop. What did he do? A tear rolled down Ruth's cheek. He wanted nothing to do with it. The words hung in the room. Cruel. Simple. Real. Sometimes the worst wounds weren't dramatic. Sometimes they were just abandonment. Eli stood quietly and walked to his backpack. He unzipped one of the side pockets. Then he removed a worn envelope. The paper looked old, protected, hidden. He carried it across the room and handed it to Maren. Miss Ruth told me to keep this safe. Maren looked at her mother. Ruth nodded. Slowly, fearfully, open it. Maren slid a finger beneath the flap. Inside was a birth certificate. She unfolded it carefully. Her eyes moved across the page. Mother, Vanessa Reed. Father, not listed. Nothing unusual, until she reached the bottom. There, written in faded blue ink beside an emergency contact section, was an old address, a familiar address, Grant's address from 12 years earlier. And suddenly Maren understood why someone had been calling county offices asking whether Eli had been found. Maren barely touched breakfast the next morning. The birth certificate sat on the table between her and Ruth, like a question nobody could fully answer yet. An address was not proof. A dying woman's belief was not proof, but together they were enough to make one thing clear. Too many things in this family had been hidden behind silence, and silence had already cost them too much. By 9 o'clock, Maren was sitting inside the office of an elder law attorney recommended by Angela. The office occupied the 2nd floor of an old brick building downtown. Nothing about it felt dramatic. No polished television courtroom, no grand speeches, just shelves full of binders, stacks of paperwork, and a woman named Linda Carson, who had spent 20 years helping elderly people whose trust had been abused. Linda listened carefully while Maren explained everything. The house, the power of attorney papers, the missing money, the bus depot. The attorney never interrupted. She simply took notes. When Maren finished, Linda folded her hands. The first thing we need is documentation. Maren almost laughed. Everybody seemed to be saying the same thing. Documentation, records, paper trails, the unglamorous things that often mattered more than outrage. Linda opened a legal pad. Do you have access to your mother's bank records? Some. We'll need more. What about the house? Linda nodded. We'll pull the property records. And Grant? The attorney looked at her carefully. What about him? Maren hesitated. Part of her still wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding, some explanation, something that could make this hurt less, but another part already knew better. I want to know what really happened. Linda nodded once. Then we follow the facts. The next several days became a blur of appointments, bank statements, phone calls, records requests, forms, signatures. The work was slow, sometimes painfully slow, but piece by piece the picture became clearer and uglier. One afternoon, Linda called Maren into her office. Several folders sat open across the desk. I think we've found something. Maren sat down immediately. Linda slid over a stack of account statements. These withdrawals came from Ruth's checking account. Maren scanned the pages. Gas stations, hardware stores, restaurants, sporting goods retailers, places Ruth never visited. The amounts weren't enormous, that almost made them worse. A few $100 here, 500 there, 800 somewhere else. Spread over years, easy to miss, easy to explain away, until someone added everything together. Maren looked up. Mom doesn't even drive. Linda nodded. Exactly. The attorney turned another page. There's more. A local pharmacy had provided records. Several prescriptions for Ruth's blood pressure medication had never been picked up. Others were collected months late. Maren stared at the dates. She was supposed to take these daily. Yes, Grant handled her medications. Linda didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. A few days later, Maren visited the old neighborhood again. This time she wasn't looking at the boarded-up house. She was looking for people. People remembered things. People noticed things. A former neighbor named Mrs. Harper invited her onto a small porch shaded by an old maple tree. The elderly woman spoke slowly, carefully, like someone who had spent years deciding whether to get involved. I saw your mother crying. Maren felt her stomach tighten. When? More than once. Mrs. Harper looked toward the abandoned property, especially near the end. What happened? The older woman sighed. There were arguments. Between Mom and Grant? A nod. Mostly between your mother and Denise, Grant's wife. The name immediately caught Maren's attention. What kind of arguments? Mrs. Harper hesitated. The kind where somebody keeps being reminded they're a burden. The words landed heavily. Not because they were dramatic, because they sounded real, too real. Mrs. Harper continued. One afternoon I saw your mother carrying boxes, clothes, personal things. The woman paused. She looked embarrassed. Maren closed her eyes briefly. Her mother had lost a home. Yet the humiliation seemed to hurt even more. Not the loss itself, the way it happened, the way nobody protected her dignity. Before leaving, Maren asked one final question. When did you last see her there? Mrs. Harper looked toward the street. The week before she disappeared. Disappeared. The word echoed in Maren's mind all the way back to the hotel. That evening she met Angelo again. The outreach worker brought copies of intake records from the bus depot program, dates, assessments, emergency housing notes, basic medical screenings, nothing emotional, just facts. Yet the facts were devastating. Ruth had been officially documented as homeless. Homeless. The word still felt impossible. Angela pointed to a date. This was her first intake, 3 months earlier. Exactly as Ruth had said, no exaggeration, no confusion. 3 months. Maren studied the paperwork. Then another detail caught her eye. Who brought her in? Angela checked. A volunteer. Not Grant? No. Maren swallowed hard. Of course not. The deeper she dug, the harder it became to find evidence that Grant had ever tried to help. Every record seemed to point in the opposite direction. The following Friday, Linda called again. Her voice sounded different, more serious. Can you come in? Is something wrong? Maybe. An hour later, Maren sat across from her desk. Several property documents were spread out in neat rows. The attorney pointed to one. This is the sale paperwork. Maren recognized her mother's signature, or what looked like her mother's signature. Her chest tightened. Linda pointed again. This is the notarization. What does that mean? It means a licensed notary supposedly witnessed the signing. Maren nodded. So? Linda looked at her carefully. I thought something looked odd. The attorney slid another sheet forward. I started checking. A knot formed in Maren's stomach. Checking what? The notary. The room felt very quiet. Linda removed her glasses. Then she spoke. The person who supposedly witnessed Ruth signing these documents died 2 years before the house was sold. For several seconds, Maren didn't understand. The words refused to fit together. Then suddenly they did. And when they did, everything changed. Because a dead notary couldn't witness anything, which meant somebody had lied. And if somebody had lied about that, what else had they lied about? The discovery about the notary changed everything. Until then, Maren had been uncovering signs of neglect, signs of manipulation, signs of financial abuse. Now there was a possibility that someone had crossed into something far more serious. Forgery, fraud, documents that should never have existed. For the first time since returning home, Maren saw something she hadn't seen before in Linda Carson's office. Caution. The attorney no longer spoke about misunderstandings. She spoke about evidence. We don't make accusations until we can support them, Linda said. But if this document is invalid, the entire sale may become part of a larger investigation. Marin nodded. She wanted answers, but she wanted them the right way. That afternoon she returned to the hotel and found Ruth sitting by the window. Eli was doing homework at the small desk. The scene looked peaceful, almost normal, yet all three of them seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for the next piece to fall. "Mama," Marin said gently, "Grant invited us to dinner." Ruth's shoulders immediately stiffened. The reaction was instant, uncontrolled, like a body remembering danger before the mind could explain it. "No." The answer came too quickly. Marin sat beside her. "You don't have to go." Ruth looked relieved. "I don't want trouble." Trouble, that word again. The strange language families developed when they spent years avoiding the truth. Grant had sold her home, left her homeless, possibly taken money meant for her care. And somehow Ruth still worried about causing trouble. Later that evening, Marin drove alone to Grant's house. The invitation had come through text. A simple message: "Let's talk like adults, no apology, no concern, just a request." The neighborhood looked different from the one where Ruth had lived. Larger homes, new landscaping, fresh paint. Signs of money, not luxury, but comfort. Grant opened the door before she knocked. For a second they simply stared at each other, brother and sister, separated by more than distance. "You look tired," Grant said. Marin almost laughed. "You look nervous." A shadow crossed his face, then disappeared. Inside, Denise was setting plates on the dining table. She greeted Marin with a smile that never reached her eyes. Everything felt carefully arranged: the food, the conversation, the performance, as if they had rehearsed normality before she arrived. For a while they discussed harmless things: London, work, travel, the weather. Nobody mentioned Ruth, nobody mentioned the bus depot, nobody mentioned Eli. The silence itself became exhausting. Finally Marin put down her fork. "When were you planning to tell me?" The room froze. Grant looked up. "Tell you what?" "The truth." Denise shifted in her chair. Grant sighed. "There isn't one truth." There it was. The second defense, not denial, relativism, as though facts could become opinions. Marin held his gaze. "Mom was homeless. She left." "No, yes." The answer came fast, almost rehearsed. "She chose to leave." Marin stared at him. Even now, even after everything, he was still trying to make Ruth responsible for her own abandonment. Grant leaned forward. "You haven't been here." The words carried years of resentment, years of frustration. "You sent money, great. But I was the one doing everything." Marin remained silent. Grant continued. "Doctor appointments, home repairs, problems at all hours. I handled it." Something cracked beneath the surface. Not guilt, something older, bitterness. "You got to be the successful one overseas." He laughed bitterly. "You know what people said?" Marin said, "Nothing, they praised you." Another laugh. "They called every dollar a sacrifice." His eyes hardened. "But nobody asked what it cost me to stay." The room became very quiet. For the first time Marin saw part of the truth. Not an excuse, never an excuse, but a motive. Grant had spent years feeling invisible. Years comparing himself to the sister whose success seemed obvious from a distance. Years believing he deserved recognition he never received. And somewhere inside that resentment, something had gone wrong. Very wrong. Denise reached for her wine glass. Grant did his best. Marin turned toward her. "Did he?" Denise's jaw tightened. "You don't know what your mother is like." There it was. A sentence that instantly made Marin's skin crawl. Because people rarely said that about elderly parents they respected. "What does that mean?" Denise shrugged. She always needed something. Grant looked uncomfortable. Not because Denise was lying, because she was saying things out loud. The mask was slipping. Marin watched carefully. People often revealed more than they intended when they felt justified. Denise continued. "The house situation wasn't simple." "What house situation?" "The one where she refused to understand reality." Grant shot her a warning glance. Too late. Marin noticed. Immediately, something passed between them. A shared secret, a moment of panic, and then it happened. The mistake, small, almost invisible, the kind that changes everything. Denise shook her head and muttered, "She should have been grateful we even tried after she ended up at that depot." Silence, absolute silence. Grant froze. Marin stared. Denise's eyes widened. The words had escaped before she could stop them. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then Marin asked quietly, "How did you know she was at the depot?" Denise looked at Grant. Grant looked away. The answer was already there. They knew, they had known, all along. Not guessed, not suspected, known. The realization hit harder than any confession. because it meant Ruth had not simply disappeared. She had not vanished into the city. They knew exactly where she was sleeping, exactly where she was struggling, exactly where she was spending cold nights. And they had done nothing. Marin slowly stood. The dinner was over, the performance was over, the excuses were over. Grant rose too. Marin, wait, for what? It isn't that simple. Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. No, her voice remained calm, dangerously calm. It is. She grabbed her coat, then stopped. One final question. The question she had been carrying since the birth certificate, since the envelope, since the photograph. She looked directly at her brother. What do you know about Eli? For the first time that entire evening, genuine fear appeared on Grant's face. Not anger, not annoyance, fear, and that told her more than any answer could have. Marin left without another word. By the time she reached her car, her hands were shaking. Not from rage, from certainty. The lies were connected, the house, the money, the depot, the boy. She just didn't know exactly how yet. Her phone vibrated. A message. From Angela. Only 4 words, call me immediately. Marin's stomach dropped. She dialed before starting the engine. Angela answered on the first ring. Her voice sounded breathless. Marin, what happened? A pause. Then the words that made her heart stop. Ruth collapsed. Marin barely remembered the drive to the hospital. One moment she was standing beside her car outside Grant's house. The next she was running through the emergency entrance of Mercy Medical Center. Everything in between felt blurred. The fluorescent lights, the sliding doors, the smell of disinfectant, the fear, especially the fear. Angela was waiting near the reception desk. Eli sat beside her. The boy looked pale. His backpack rested at his feet. One strap wrapped tightly around his hand, as though letting go might somehow make things worse. The moment he saw Marin, he stood up. Is she okay? His voice cracked slightly. The question hit Marin harder than she expected, because he asked it the same way a grandson would, the same way family would. Marin crouched in front of him. I don't know yet. Trying to be brave, trying not to cry, trying to be older than 12. Angela stepped closer. The doctors are evaluating her now. What happened? She got dizzy. Angela looked exhausted. Then she fainted. Marin closed her eyes briefly. Months in a bus depot, missed medications, poor nutrition, constant stress. Maybe her body had simply reached its limit. A nurse appeared several minutes later. Family for Ruth Cole? Marin stood immediately. I'm her daughter. The nurse nodded. Come with me. The hospital room was small, quiet. Machines hummed softly. Ruth lay in bed beneath white blankets. An IV line ran into her arm. Her face looked even thinner than before. For a moment Marin saw not the woman who raised her, not the woman who survived decades of hardship, just an elderly patient, fragile, vulnerable, human. And suddenly she hated how easy it was for society to overlook people once they became weak. Ruth opened her eyes. A small smile appeared. You came. The words nearly broke Marin. I'm right here. Ruth reached for her hand. The grip felt weak, but determined, like she still wanted to reassure her daughter. Even now, a physician entered a few minutes later. He introduced himself and reviewed the initial findings. Dehydration, poor medication compliance, elevated blood pressure, signs of prolonged physical stress, nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to require observation. Marin listened carefully. Every detail felt like evidence, not evidence for a courtroom, evidence of what neglect looked like in real life. It rarely arrived as bruises. Sometimes it arrived as prescriptions never filled, missed appointments, skipped meals, people slowly disappearing in plain sight. The doctor was preparing to leave when another question emerged. Who has medical authority? The room fell silent. Marin frowned. What do you mean? The physician glanced at his chart. We have documents listing a power of attorney. Marin's stomach dropped. Of course, Grant, the same paperwork, the same signatures. The same shadow reaching into yet another part of Ruth's life. Before Marin could respond, the door opened, and Grant walked in. The timing felt unreal, yet not surprising. Someone from the hospital had likely contacted him based on existing records. He stopped when he saw Marin, then looked toward Ruth. For a brief second, genuine concern crossed his face. Not enough to erase everything, but enough to remind Marin that people were rarely one thing, even people who caused tremendous harm. Mom, Ruth looked away. The gesture hurt more than an argument. Grant seemed to feel it. His shoulders dropped slightly. The physician addressed him. You're listed as medical power of attorney. Marin stepped forward. That paperwork is under review. Grant immediately stiffened. What does that mean? It means exactly what it sounds like. The tension in the room became immediate. The doctor wisely excused himself, leaving the family alone. Grant looked at Marin. You've been talking to lawyers, yes? His jaw tightened. You think I'm some criminal? Marin stared at him. The question felt almost absurd, not because she knew everything, because she knew enough. I think Mom lost her house. Silence. I think her medications weren't being managed. More silence. I think she ended up homeless. Grant looked away. For the first time since she'd returned home, he had no explanation ready. No speech, no defense, just silence, and silence often said more than words. The confrontation ended when a hospital social worker entered. A woman named Karen Mitchell, experienced, professional, observant, the kind of person who had likely heard every family story imaginable. She reviewed Ruth's situation carefully, asked gentle questions, took notes, watched reactions. Nothing about her approach felt accusatory. Yet Marin noticed something. Karen wasn't simply gathering information, she was assessing safety. By the end of the conversation, she requested a private meeting with Ruth later that day. After Grant left the room, Eli finally came inside. The moment he saw Ruth awake, relief flooded across his face. He rushed to her bedside. Not dramatically, just honestly, like a child who had been scared. Ruth smiled. There you are. I thought something bad happened. She squeezed his hand. I'm still here. The boy sat beside her bed for nearly 2 hours, helping adjust blankets, fetching water, reminding nurses about medications. Little things, small things, the kind of things children shouldn't have to know, yet somehow he did. Watching them together, Marin realized something painful. Eli had spent months caring for Ruth, and Ruth had spent months caring for him. Two vulnerable people protecting each other because the adults who should have helped were missing. Late that evening, after Eli fell asleep in a chair near the window, Ruth asked Marin to close the door. The request immediately felt important. Marin sat beside the bed. What is it? For several seconds, Ruth stared at the sleeping boy. Then she sighed, a tired sound, a mother's sound. I need to tell you something. Marin waited. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. I stayed quiet because of you. The words caught her off guard. What do you mean? I didn't want my children to hate each other. The confession came slowly, painfully. I thought if I endured it, eventually things would calm down. Another tear slid down her cheek. I kept thinking tomorrow would be different. Marin squeezed her hand. But Ruth wasn't finished. She reached toward the drawer beside the hospital bed. Angela had brought her belongings earlier. Inside the drawer sat a small notebook. Nothing special, worn cover, bent corners, a cheap spiral binding. Ruth handed it to her. I wrote things down. Marin opened it carefully. Dates, appointments, medication shortages, arguments, requests for money, threats, observations, years of small details. The handwriting remained neat throughout, even when the entries became painful. Page after page, month after month. The notebook wasn't dramatic. It was something far more powerful. A record, a witness. A voice nobody had managed to silence. Marin looked up slowly. Her mother wiped her eyes. I thought if something happened to me, someone should know. The room suddenly felt colder, heavier, because for the first time, Marin understood that Ruth had been documenting her own decline, preparing for the possibility that nobody would believe her. At that exact moment, there was a soft knock at the door. Karen Mitchell stepped inside, the hospital social worker. She smiled gently at Ruth, then pulled a chair beside the bed. There was kindness in her face, but there was also purpose. She opened her folder, looked directly at Ruth, and asked a single question. Do you feel safe with your son, Grant? The question seemed to settle over the room like a weight. Do you feel safe with your son, Grant? Karen Mitchell's voice was calm, not accusatory, not leading, just patient. The kind of question that left no place to hide. Ruth stared at the blanket covering her lap. Her hands trembled slightly. For a moment, nobody spoke, not Karen, not Marin, not even Eli. The boy had woken up when the social worker entered. Now he sat quietly near the window, watching, waiting. Ruth's eyes slowly filled with tears. Then she shook her head. No. The word barely rose above a whisper, yet it changed everything. Karen nodded gently, not surprised, just saddened. Thank you for being honest. Ruth wiped her eyes. I don't think he wanted this. Karen listened carefully, but it happened anyway. Ruth nodded. The The social worker Pew noted. Then she asked more questions, simple questions, specific questions, questions about housing, money, medical care, decision-making, threats, control. Each answer added another piece to a picture that had been forming for weeks. By the time the conversation ended, Karen's expression had grown increasingly serious. Before leaving, she looked at Maren. "I'd like to coordinate with your attorney." Maren understood immediately. The concerns were no longer private family matters. Professionals were becoming involved. Systems were beginning to pay attention. After Karen left, the room remained quiet. Ruth looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. Years of protecting Grant were finally colliding with reality. Maren sat beside her. "You don't have to carry this by yourself anymore." Ruth looked away. A fresh tear slid down her cheek. "I never wanted him to be seen as a bad man." The words hurt, because they sounded exactly like something a mother would say. Even after everything, even now. Maren squeezed her hand. "We're not doing this to punish him." Ruth nodded slowly. "I know," but part of her still grieved. Not for the house, not for the money. For the son she thought she knew. The following week moved quickly, too quickly. Linda Carson filed requests for emergency protective measures. The hospital social worker submitted her concerns. Financial records continued arriving. More documents, more dates, more evidence, each piece connected to the next. One afternoon, Maren sat inside Linda's office reviewing a stack of papers. The attorney pointed towards several highlighted transactions. "These are the withdrawals we discussed." Maren nodded. Then Linda pointed toward another section. "And these." Several deposits appeared. Business account transfers, loan payments, equipment financing. The timeline was impossible to ignore. Money left Ruth's accounts. Then debt payments appeared elsewhere. Not direct proof, but a pattern, a very troubling pattern. Linda leaned back. "The court doesn't require certainty right now. What does it require?" "Enough evidence to justify intervention." Maren looked down at the documents. There was already more than enough. Several days later, a temporary protective hearing was scheduled. Nothing dramatic. No jury, no television courtroom. Just a judge reviewing concerns involving an elderly woman's welfare. Still, Maren barely slept the night before. Because this hearing represented something bigger. For the first time, Ruth's voice would exist somewhere official. Somewhere it could not simply be dismissed. The courthouse occupied an ordinary government building. Gray walls, security checkpoints, plastic chairs, people dealing with everyday legal problems. Inside one small hearing room, the future of Ruth's life was about to be discussed. Grant arrived early. Denise sat beside him. Neither looked comfortable. For the first time since Maren returned home, Grant seemed tired, really tired. The confidence he usually wore was gone. When he noticed Maren, he looked away. Eli sat beside Ruth. The boy wore a button-down shirt borrowed from a church clothing program. He looked nervous, but determined. The hearing began. Linda presented records carefully. One fact: a bank time, medical records, housing documentation, withdrawal histories, the notebook Ruth had kept. Nothing exaggerated, nothing emotional, just evidence. The judge listened attentively, occasionally asking questions, occasionally requesting clarification. The most powerful moments came from unexpected places. Mrs. Harper, the former neighbor, described seeing Ruth carry boxes from the house. A representative from the redevelopment company confirmed the property sale had moved unusually quickly. Angela testified about Ruth's intake at the bus depot, the dates, the conditions, the circumstances. Each testimony built upon the last, brick by brick, fact by fact. Then came a moment nobody expected. The judge looked directly at Grant. "Did you know where your mother was living?" The room became very still. Grant hesitated. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he answered, "Yes." The word landed heavily. Even Denise looked down. The judge continued. "And did you provide support after learning this?" Grant swallowed. "No." Silence followed, the painful kind, the kind that appears when truth finally arrives. Not dramatic, just undeniable. Ruth sat quietly throughout most of the hearing. Then the judge asked if she wished to speak. For a moment, Maren worried she would decline. Ruth had spent years making herself smaller, years avoiding conflict, years protecting everyone except herself. But then she stood, slowly, carefully, and walked toward the front. The room fell silent. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. "I don't hate my son." Grant closed his eyes. Ruth continued, I never wanted this, a pause. But I lost my home, another pause. I became afraid to ask questions. The room remained completely still. I started feeling like I didn't matter. Those words hurt more than any accusation. Because neglect often worked that way. Not through violence, through erosion. Slowly convincing someone their needs no longer counted. Ruth looked toward the judge, then toward Grant, then toward Eli, and finally toward Maren. I matter. The statement was simple, small, yet powerful, because for the first time in years she said it publicly, without apology. Without shame, the hearing continued. More documents were reviewed, more testimony entered the record. Then Linda requested permission to introduce one final issue. The judge allowed it. Linda looked toward Grant. What do you know about Eli Reed? Immediately, tension filled the room. Grant's face changed. Not dramatically, but enough. The reaction was impossible to miss. Linda continued. A child connected to your mother. Grant looked toward the floor. The judge watched carefully. Everyone watched carefully. Linda asked another question. Did you know Vanessa Reed? Grant closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. A murmur moved through the room. Very small, very human. The judge immediately restored order. Grant remained silent. Linda waited. Finally Grant spoke. His voice sounded tired, defeated. I knew her. Another pause. Then came the statement nobody in the room expected him to make. I knew there was a chance. The words echoed through the hearing room. A chance. Not certainty, not proof, but enough. Enough to explain years of avoidance. Enough to explain fear. Enough to explain why Eli had become a problem Grant wanted to disappear. The judge looked toward the boy, then back toward Grant, and suddenly the case had become bigger than financial abuse. Bigger than the house. Bigger than the bus depot. Because hidden beneath everything else was a child nobody had wanted to claim. At the end of the hearing, the judge issued temporary orders. Ruth's finances would be protected. The power of attorney would be suspended pending further review. Additional investigation into the property sale would move forward. When the hearing finally ended, people slowly began gathering their belongings. No celebrations, no dramatic victory, just relief and consequences. As Maren helped Ruth toward the exit, Linda hurried over. Her expression was serious. There's something else. Maren stopped.
What?
Linda lowered her voice. The investigators just contacted me. A pause. Then they found another document connected to the house sale. Maren felt her stomach tighten. What kind of document? Linda looked toward Grant, who was standing across the hallway, then back at Maren. The signature on that document may not belong to your mother at all. 3 months later, the apartment smelled faintly of tea and fresh paint. It sat on the second floor of a quiet building less than 10 minutes from Maren's townhouse. Nothing about it was luxurious. The kitchen was small. The living room barely fit a sofa and 2 chairs, but every choice inside it belonged to Ruth. The curtains were pale yellow, the kind she always liked, the kind nobody had asked about for years. The first thing she had insisted on after moving in was a lock on the bedroom door, not because she was afraid, because she wanted one, because she could, because after everything that had happened, having a door that locked from the inside felt strangely important. A small thing. A meaningful thing. The investigation into the house sale continued. The handwriting expert hired through the court concluded that one of the signatures used during the transaction almost certainly had not been written by Ruth. The property transfer was being challenged. Financial records were under review. Restitution proceedings had begun. None of it moved quickly. Real life rarely did. But for the first time, the system was moving in Ruth's direction instead of against her. Grant was no longer in charge of her finances, no longer in charge of her medical decisions, no longer in charge of the story. The consequences reached beyond the courtroom. Several creditors learned where some of the money had come from. His business struggled further. Old relationships disappeared. People stopped returning calls. The respect he had spent years chasing slipped through his fingers faster than he ever imagined. Not because someone destroyed him, because the truth finally arrived. Denise lasted another month, then she left. There was no dramatic fight, no scene, just boxes carried quietly to a rental truck. The image she had spent years protecting no longer existed. And without the money, without the house, without the appearance of success, she chose herself. Grant ended up alone in a small apartment on the edge of the city. Maren heard about it through mutual acquaintances. She never celebrated. Some wounds were too serious for victory laps. The deepest punishment wasn't legal. It was knowing exactly what he had lost. Eli's situation moved through family court and child services the way these cases often did. Slowly, carefully, with more paperwork than emotion. The DNA test eventually confirmed what everyone had suspected. Grant was his biological father. The result changed some things, but not everything. Because biology explained a connection, it did not create a relationship. By then, Eli had already decided who had shown up for him, who had listened, who had stayed. A kinship arrangement was approved. He remained with Ruth and under Marin's support while longer-term plans were established. For the first time in years, the boy had a stable address, a consistent school, his own desk, his own closet, his own room. The room wasn't large, but he kept it spotless. One afternoon, Marin found him sitting on the floor organizing books on a shelf. He looked up and smiled. A real smile, not the guarded expression he had worn in the bus depot, not the cautious smile of a child preparing for disappointment, just happiness, simple and honest. The sight stayed with her all day. Healing happened like that sometimes, quietly, without announcements, without anyone noticing the exact moment it began. Ruth changed too, not all at once. Little by little. She started walking every morning. She joined a church group. She bought a small radio for the kitchen. Sometimes Marin arrived unexpectedly and found her humming while preparing lunch. The sound always stopped her in her tracks, because she realized she had never heard her mother hum during those final years before everything collapsed. The music had disappeared long before the house did. Now it was returning. One ordinary Saturday afternoon, Marin stopped by carrying groceries. She found Ruth sitting near the window with a cup of tea. Sunlight rested across the room. The yellow curtains moved gently in the breeze. For a while neither woman spoke. They simply sat together, the way family sometimes should, without schedules, without urgency, without someone waiting on the other end of a phone call. Finally Marin broke the silence. "I'm sorry." Ruth looked over. "For what?" Marin stared into her tea, for not seeing it. The words came slowly. "I thought sending money was enough." Ruth didn't answer immediately. She set her cup down carefully, then reached across the table. Her hand found Marin's, warm, steady, familiar. "You were building a life. I should have come home sooner." "Maybe." The honesty surprised her. Then Ruth smiled softly. "But that's not what hurts most." Marin looked up. Ruth's eyes glistened, not with sadness, with understanding, the kind only parents sometimes possess. "I never needed a perfect daughter." The room became very quiet. "I only needed my daughter close enough to see." Marin felt something inside her finally break. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough. Enough for the guilt she had carried to become something else. Something lighter, something she could live with. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against her mother's shoulder. Neither woman spoke. They didn't need to. Some truths arrived after words were finished. That evening before leaving, Marin walked down the hallway and past Eli's room. The door stood open. Inside, the boy sat at his desk doing homework. A lamp glowed beside him. Books lined the shelf. A baseball cap hung from the bedpost. Normal things, ordinary things, things every child deserved. He glanced up. Marin smiled. "Tomorrow." He nodded and returned to his work. Certain she would be there, certain someone would come back. For a child who had lost so much, that certainty mattered. Months earlier, Ruth had slept on a folding cot inside an abandoned bus depot. Now she lived in a home she chose herself. Months earlier, Eli carried his life inside a backpack. Now he argued with teachers about homework and forgot to make his bed. Months earlier, silence protected lies. Now truth had a place to live. And sometimes that was what healing looked like. Not perfection, not forgetting, just safety, just dignity, just another ordinary day that no longer had to be survived. As the evening sun faded beyond the window, Ruth locked her apartment door from the inside and smiled to herself. A small sound, a peaceful sound. The sound of someone finally home. And if this story made you think of a parent, a grandparent, or someone who has grown quiet over the years, maybe reach out to them today. Sometimes the most important conversations begin with a simple question. And if this story stayed with you, feel free to share your thoughts below and join us again for another story.